My husband thought his affair was a secret, so I planned the kind of revenge that left him broke, alone, and begging me back. So here's the thing. You think you know someone, you really do. You wake up every day with them, share a life, maybe even a house, a dog, and a dozen inside jokes that only make sense to you two. And then one morning, something small, tiny, inconsequential even, shatters the whole illusion. For me, it wasn't a dramatic caught him kissing someone moment. No, it was far more insidious, and that made it worse. It was the little things: a faint perfume scent I didn't recognize, a text that flashed on his phone from someone named M, which he quickly slid into his pocket, pretending it was nothing, and the way he started keeping his phone in the bedroom instead of the kitchen like he used to. At first, I tried to convince myself I was overreacting. Maybe M was a coworker. Maybe the perfume was from a client at his office. Maybe I was just being paranoid. I pride myself on being level-headed, on not letting my imagination run wild. But then came the receipts. I found them accidentally, shoved in the bottom of the trash bin because apparently even the most careful people get sloppy. Lunches at places that didn't exist on the way to work. Hotel stays that he claimed were business trips but were always suspiciously convenient. And honestly, the pattern was screaming at me before I even understood it. My stomach turned every time I pieced another receipt into the puzzle. I didn't confront him, not yet. I needed proof. You know that feeling when you suspect someone is lying to you but don't have the receipts? Or in my case, the screenshots, hotel confirmations, and subtle witness accounts to back it up. That's what I felt. And the thing is, you can't just catch someone without it being messy, because then they cover their tracks and you end up looking paranoid instead of justified. So I started quietly. Like a shadow, I observed. I watched his habits, the way he moved through the house, the times he suddenly became busy or too tired to have dinner with me. I didn't check his phone constantly. That would have felt like desperation. But I did notice patterns. Weekdays suddenly had work dinners. Weekends were too occupied with friends I didn't know he had. He started going to the gym at odd hours and even mentioned catching up with M for lunch a little too casually. And then there was the voice in my head, the one I tried to silence because it scared me. He's cheating. I wanted to argue with it. I wanted to tell myself, no, you're imagining things. You're being dramatic. You've watched too many Lifetime movies. But every time I tried, I found another piece of evidence. A voicemail that didn't make sense. A Lyft receipt at 2 a.m. that coincided with a business meeting he claimed to have. The man I thought I knew was vanishing behind a curtain of lies and excuses, and I couldn't reach him anymore. The realization hit me slowly, like dripping water wearing down stone. It wasn't immediate. It didn't come with fireworks. It came with subtle, piercing moments. The way he laughed at a message I couldn't see, the way his attention would shift mid-conversation, the way he suddenly had to run out for errands that conveniently aligned with secret calls. And when I finally found the email, the one he accidentally left open on the laptop, confirming dates, hotels, and messages between him and her, I didn't cry at first. I didn't yell. I just stared. I stared at the screen until my eyes blurred. Then I did something I hadn't expected. I laughed. Not because it was funny, but because the absurdity of it all was overwhelming. He actually thought he could get away with it. He thought that after years of marriage, years of building a life together, he could sneak around in secret. And he was sloppy enough that it was obvious. Too obvious. After the initial shock, anger hit. And not just anger. The kind of searing, deep, gut-level betrayal that makes your body feel like it's physically splitting in two. Every memory suddenly had a shadow over it. Every inside joke, every dinner, every laugh, they were all now tainted by the fact that, while I thought we were building a life together, he was sneaking around, weaving another life in parallel. I won't lie, I wanted to confront him right there. I wanted to scream, to throw things, to make him feel even a fraction of the pain he caused me. But something held me back. Something sharper than anger. Something cold and deliberate. I realized then that I wasn't going to be a screaming, sobbing victim in this story. I wasn't going to let him walk over me. And most importantly, I wasn't going to let him get away with it. So I did what anyone with a shred of sanity would do when faced with a betrayal like this. I planned. I started keeping records. Every suspicious text, every secretive call, every late night meeting. I began photographing receipts, saving emails, even noting small lies he told me. I didn't confront him, didn't accuse him, didn't even hint that I knew. I waited, because I knew the truth would reveal itself more clearly if I let him dig his own hole deeper. And then, as I quietly observed, I started to notice his arrogance. The thing that would become his downfall. He thought he was clever. He thought I was naive. He thought his little games were invisible. And that's when I smiled, almost without realizing it. Because the thing about arrogance is that it makes people careless. It makes them predictable. And I had all the time in the world. I spent nights plotting. I researched. I looked into ways people cover their tracks, how affairs usually crumble, how revenge can be perfectly calculated. I didn't want to just catch him. I wanted to obliterate the illusion he had built for himself. I wanted him to regret every second he thought he could lie to me. And yet, in the back of my mind, a part of me mourned what our life had been, or what I thought it was. That's the weird part about betrayal. It isn't just anger, it's grief too. The life you thought you had is suddenly gone, and you're left holding fragments of memories that now feel hollow. But grief didn't win. Anger didn't win either. Not entirely. What took over was clarity. Cold, sharp clarity. I had a plan forming, piece by piece. And I knew that if I played my cards right, this wouldn't just be about him getting caught. It would be about him losing everything he thought he had secured. His money, his friends, his ego, and most importantly, the idea that he could control me. So that's where I was. Shocked? Yes, but no longer paralyzed. Betrayed? Yes, but no longer powerless. And from that moment, I stopped being just his wife. I became something far more dangerous. A woman who knew the truth and wasn't afraid to make him pay. Little did he know, the biggest mistake of his life wasn't the affair itself. It was underestimating me, and I was about to start making him regret every single moment he thought he was untouchable. After the initial storm of shock, anger, and disbelief faded, I realized something crucial. Knowing about the affair wasn't enough. If I just confronted him or stormed out, I'd be reacting. And reacting was exactly what he wanted. Reacting meant chaos, drama, tears, things that make for a messy confrontation but rarely satisfy the deeper desire for justice. I didn't want messy. I wanted meticulous. I wanted a plan so precise, so carefully calculated, that by the time he realized what was happening, there would be no coming back. The first step, obviously, was to understand him, not just as my husband, but as a human being with weaknesses, blind spots, and vulnerabilities I could exploit. I started observing him, not in a creepy, paranoia-driven way, but with the precision of a strategist mapping out the battlefield. Money was his Achilles heel. He had this ego-driven obsession with wealth, investments, and maintaining an image of success. I started looking through the household accounts, his business ventures, credit cards, and recurring payments. I noted every necessary expense, every shady financial maneuver he bragged about to friends, and every loose end in his investments. It wasn't illegal yet, but it was sloppy, which made it perfect for later. Then came the social layer. My husband thrived on image. He loved being admired by colleagues, friends, and even casual acquaintances. He wasn't maliciously narcissistic. Well, maybe a little, but he genuinely believed people respected him because of his charm, not realizing most of them were just waiting for him to slip. That ego, that was another vulnerability. People like him, people like anyone who cheats and hides, are arrogant. They underestimate others. I intended to use that. Finally, I mapped his friends and associates, who would support him blindly, who would waver, who secretly hated him or envied him. This social map became essential for the next stages of my plan. If I could manipulate perception subtly, I could make him crumble from the outside in. But I knew I couldn't do this alone. I needed knowledge, strategic knowledge. Started consulting discreetly. Not in a tell everyone my husband's a cheater way, but in professional, plausible ways that wouldn't raise suspicion. I reached out to financial advisors under the guise of general portfolio management advice. I asked lawyers about loopholes in marital law and the nuances of joint finances. I read articles and forums on financial sabotage, not to break the law, but to exploit gaps and weaknesses that only sloppy rich people left behind. It became a study of human behavior, finances, and law rolled into one. Every night, I sat with spreadsheets, notes, and mental simulations of what could go wrong for him, and how I could make it happen. I became obsessed, not in a self-destructive way, but in a disciplined, controlled way. Every detail mattered, every pattern mattered, and slowly a blueprint for revenge emerged. Step 1, financial sabotage. I didn't want him to simply lose a little money. I wanted him to feel the ground shifting beneath his feet. I devised ways to subtly manipulate his investments, redirect funds, and exploit his overconfidence in deals he barely understood. Nothing illegal on my part, but enough to make him panic when he finally noticed the discrepancies. Step 2, social humiliation. He thrived on appearances, but appearances are fragile. I started planting seeds of doubt among his friends and colleagues. Not outright accusations, yet, but subtle observations that made them question his loyalty, honesty, and judgment. A misplaced email here, an accidental mention there. People love gossip, and if you plant the right seeds, it spreads faster than any wildfire. Step 3, personal exposure. This was the part I savored most in my imagination. I already had proof of the affair, but I needed to hold it like a sword, knowing exactly when to reveal it for maximum impact. Timing would be everything. Too soon, and the shock would pass. Too late, and I risked him covering his tracks. But if I executed it at the perfect moment, the personal exposure would shatter his life in ways money or friends never could. Planning all this wasn't easy. It required patience, stealth, and self-control. I had to compartmentalize my emotions. Every time I felt the urge to lash out, I reminded myself, anger is temporary, satisfaction is permanent, but only if you play it right. I also had to be careful not to leave traces of my own preparation. Spreadsheets had to be on encrypted drives, notes in private folders, research done under plausible pretenses. Any hint of my plotting would ruin the entire plan. And yes, there was fear. I won't sugarcoat it. Fear of discovery, fear of making a misstep, fear of losing myself in the process. But that fear was exhilarating in a strange way. It kept me sharp. It kept me alert. Every moment became a chess move, every interaction a potential test of his awareness. I started small, testing my strategies. I shifted minor funds, casually mentioned budget concerns at dinner to gauge his reaction, and watched how he interacted with friends differently when subtle doubts were introduced. His responses gave me invaluable information. Like a lab experiment in human behavior, each reaction confirmed I was on the right track. One night, I caught him bragging to a colleague about a deal he had closed, one that I had subtly sabotaged earlier. The smug look on his face, the casual arrogance, the assumption that he was untouchable, it made me smile. That smugness was my green light. He hadn't even noticed the first domino fall, and that was exactly how I wanted it. By the end of the month, the blueprint was solid. I had multiple layers ready to unfold simultaneously if needed. He would never see it coming, and when it hit, it would hit hard. But what excited me most wasn't the revenge itself, it was the empowerment. For the first time in weeks, maybe months, I felt in control. I wasn't the victim anymore. I wasn't the betrayed wife silently suffering. I was the strategist, the puppeteer, the architect of his downfall. The night I put the first step of the plan into motion, I couldn't sleep. I stayed up until 3 a.m., running scenarios in my head. Small manipulations of his finances here, subtle whispers among his friends, there a carefully planted suggestion to get him to overreach in some way. All minor moves, but each with a purpose. And as I watched him fall asleep on the couch, oblivious, I realized something terrifyingly exhilarating. This was just the beginning. I knew it. He thought he had me fooled, thought he could get away with his affair without consequences. But he was wrong. And when the first domino fell, the rest would follow faster than he could blink. I wasn't just planning revenge. I was reclaiming myself. And for the first time since discovering the betrayal, I felt alive. I remember the first morning I set my plan into motion like it was a secret ceremony. I brewed my coffee, sat at the kitchen table, and for a few minutes just looked at him sleeping on the couch. He had that self-satisfied little smirk even in dreams, and I almost laughed at how oblivious he was. He thought his empire was secure, that his affair was invisible, that I was just a soft, harmless wife. He wasn't harmless, and neither was this plan. The financial manipulation came first because it was subtle and satisfying. I didn't need him to suspect me yet. He was arrogant enough to assume everything was perfectly in his control. I quietly diverted a few innocuous transactions from joint accounts into one of my newly set up, legally sound but secret accounts, small enough to go unnoticed but cumulative enough to sting later. I created fake invoices for consulting fees he supposedly owed for minor deals. Nothing illegal on my part, but enough to make him chase ghosts he couldn't explain. I spent hours that first week running numbers, double-checking spreadsheets, and watching his reactions. He bragged at breakfast about a successful investment meeting he had, entirely unaware I had already subtly shifted the outcome in a way that would cost him thousands. It was like watching a cat smugly walk over a freshly set trap. But the financial angle was only part of the game. The social layer was just as delicious. My husband prided himself on being the charming one, the friend everyone admired. So I began to seed doubt, one carefully crafted comment at a time. At first, it was innocent enough. Casual remarks to his friends about his work ethic or decisions, phrased like concern. I wonder if he stretched too thin lately, I'd say. Or, I'm not sure I understand why he invested in that. It seemed risky. Nothing direct, nothing accusatory. Just tiny cracks in the image he had spent years building. One by one, the cracks appeared. A friend who had always been loyal suddenly looked hesitant during conversations. Another casually mentioned a meeting he forgot to mention. All while I gave a perfectly neutral, slightly knowing smile. People picked up on these little hints faster than I expected, and the satisfaction of watching him unknowingly poison his own reputation was intoxicating. Even family got a taste. I started pointing out small inconsistencies in his stories to relatives in passing. "Oh, didn't he say he was at the office that night?" I'd ask casually. The cousin who had always trusted him began raising eyebrows. The sister-in-law, who had secretly been annoyed with him for years, started whispering about his secretive behavior. I wasn't pushing the narrative outright. I was just planting the seeds and watching them grow organically. And then there were the little personal moments, the subtle manipulations in day-to-day life. I'd misplace small things in his office, shift documents, make a casual remark about losing track of certain expenses. Nothing he could point to and say, "She's doing something," but enough to make him double-check, triple-check, and start feeling the tiniest pangs of doubt about his control. I couldn't resist adding a bit of dark humor to it all. Like the time I accidentally emailed him a spreadsheet marked confidential that contained fake transactions. He immediately panicked, thinking he had made a costly error in front of his colleagues. I watched from the doorway, pretending to sip tea, and he nearly fell off his chair as he started typing frantic emails. It was delicious. I almost sent him a gotcha sticker in my head. By the end of the second week, the effect was clear. He was still oblivious to the source of his anxiety, but it was creeping in, tiny, imperceptible cracks in his confidence. He started asking me questions about trivial things, like, did I approve this expense? Or, did I mention that to the team? And I gave calm, neutral answers, acting as if I had no idea what he was talking about. The beauty of this method was that he never suspected malice. He didn't think anyone could be working against him. His arrogance protected me. It also made him sloppy. The more panicked he became, the more mistakes he made. He would forget small appointments, misplace minor contracts, and argue with colleagues over things that didn't make sense, all while I kept meticulous records, laughing quietly at the irony of a man who thought he was untouchable. At one point, I even managed to nudge one of his business associates subtly. A casual dinner conversation with the associate turned into a friendly concern about some of his recent decisions. I didn't accuse him. I simply asked questions and let the associate draw conclusions. By the next morning, he was nervously calling my husband to clarify things, and I was sipping coffee and smiling at my own handiwork. Socially, I was starting to see the network crumble. Friends who had once blindly defended him were now hesitant. Colleagues were double-checking facts before agreeing to anything he suggested. Family members were questioning minor discrepancies in his stories, all without me ever directly confronting anyone or spilling the truth about the affair. It was subtle, almost surgical, and it was working perfectly. Every night, I reviewed the day's progress like a general analyzing a battlefield. What had gone according to plan? Where had I underestimated him? How could I tighten the screws just a little more tomorrow? And each day, the pattern became clearer. The man who thought he could get away with everything was starting to feel unsteady, even if he didn't yet know why. There were moments I had to restrain myself. When he ranted at dinner about a supposed misunderstanding at work or complained about missing money that he didn't yet know was gone, I wanted to smile so widely it would be ridiculous. But I stayed calm, composed, polite. My silence was more devastating than any argument I could have thrown at him. Even the way he looked at me began to shift subtly. There was that flicker of uncertainty, the micro-expression of, wait, did she know something? But it vanished whenever he convinced himself he was imagining it. That little flicker became my favorite part of the day, a reminder that he was finally on shaky ground. By the end of the first month of my first strikes, the plan was working better than I imagined. Financial manipulations were causing small but noticeable issues. Friends and family were questioning him quietly. His own ego, that fragile little construct he leaned on so heavily, was beginning to wobble without him realizing why. And all the while, he still went about his daily life thinking he was untouchable, thinking his affair and his secrets were invisible. He didn't know he was standing on the edge of a cliff, and the only reason he didn't fall yet was that I hadn't pushed him all the way. Not yet. Watching him teeter, oblivious, made me realize just how much power I had. Not brute force power, not screaming power, but the quiet, deliberate kind that comes from knowing the truth, planning meticulously, and letting the other person walk right into it. And that, more than anything, felt intoxicating. I knew this was just the beginning. The first strikes had worked beautifully, but the real game, the part where he would start to crumble completely, was coming next. And when it did, I would be ready. I wasn't just exacting revenge. I was rewriting the rules. By now, he thought he was still in control. Little did he know, control had been taken from him the moment I realized the depth of his betrayal. And in a few more calculated moves, he would realize exactly how powerless he had become. I don't think I've ever felt a thrill quite like the one that comes with holding absolute control over someone who believed themselves untouchable. By this point, the subtle cracks I had been planting for weeks had grown into fissures. His friends were suspicious, his colleagues were hesitant, and even his family looked at him differently. Though he didn't understand why. But what I wanted was more than fissures. I wanted a full-scale collapse. And for that, I needed the final piece, undeniable proof of his affair. Gathering it was almost anticlimactic. He was sloppy, predictable, and utterly arrogant. He left traces everywhere, convinced that no one would ever connect the dots. Emails saved on his work server, messages he forgot to delete, hotel receipts, even social media interactions that I carefully screenshotted. I combined them with my own subtle observations and collated them into a dossier so damning that I knew the moment I revealed it, there would be no coming back. I didn't rush. Timing was everything. The art of revenge isn't just about exposing someone. It's about exposing them at the precise moment when the consequences are magnified. I watched his schedule, noting events where social and professional exposure would hurt him the most. A work dinner with investors, a birthday party with friends who adored him, a casual family gathering where his reputation was on display. Each moment, it became a potential stage, and I was a director orchestrating the chaos. The first exposure happened quietly. I forwarded selected evidence to a few key colleagues, discreetly, under the guise of a confidential concern about his professional integrity. I didn't send everything, just enough to raise doubts. Emails bounced back, phones buzzed, subtle questions started floating around about his commitment and honesty. At first it was whispers, then murmurs, and as whispers grow, they inevitably become roars. I'll admit, there was a delicious thrill in watching the panic set in across his face the first time someone asked him to clarify an obviously fabricated expense. referencing a meeting or business decision he thought no one would remember. He stammered, flustered, and started making excuses, but everyone around him had already pieced together enough to see the cracks. The real fun, though, was just beginning. Next, I targeted the social exposure. I sent the compiled evidence to a few friends who had quietly envied him over the years. Friends who had grudges, friends who were tired of covering for him, friends who were waiting for an excuse to finally stop pretending he was flawless. The reactions were almost instantaneous. Messages, calls, and subtle nods at gatherings made him feel a shift he couldn't quite put his finger on. People he once trusted began questioning his integrity and his loyalty. Even casual acquaintances started noticing inconsistencies in his stories. Meanwhile, I kept my own reactions minimal, calm, collected, neutral. The best part of being in control is that you don't need to act. The chaos unfolds on its own. And chaos it did. He became jittery, overcompensating for the invisible pressure building around him. He called me at odd hours to clarify details, begged for advice on handling rumors, and tried desperately to maintain his image. I listened patiently, never revealing what I knew, savoring every slip, every hesitation, every misstep. I also had to play the family card carefully. This was tricky because family can be unpredictable, but I strategically leaked minor hints to relatives who I knew would pass on the information, or at least start to suspect him. Casual remarks about schedules not matching up or unexpected trips were enough. Soon, even the people closest to him were starting to notice a pattern. By the time he realized the doubts, the seeds had already sprouted into a full-blown social siege. And let me tell you, watching a man like him panic is a masterclass in control. He called lawyers to ask about financial security. He begged friends for explanations about what they'd heard. He tried to smooth things over with colleagues who were already questioning his reliability. All the while, I remained 2 steps ahead. For every move he made, I had anticipated it and prepared the counter. Every attempt to salvage his life only made the cracks deeper and more visible. One of the most satisfying moments was during a networking event. He was trying to charm an important client, the type that could make or break a deal. I subtly ensured that a few carefully placed messages and whispers had already reached the client. Mid-conversation, I saw it. A flicker of doubt crossed their face and almost imperceptible hesitation. And he had no idea why. I wanted to clap, right there in the background, but I restrained myself, sipping my drink like the calm orchestrator I had become. It wasn't just about humiliation. It was about dismantling the perception he had cultivated over years. Every smile he gave, every confident gesture, every casual joke was met with subtle suspicion. Even the people who had once admired him started looking at him differently. I wasn't just exposing an affair, I was exposing the illusion of him, the carefully constructed persona he had thought untouchable. Financially, the exposure added pressure as well. A few key partners began to hesitate in dealings, subtly questioning his judgment and integrity. Investments he had thought were secure suddenly became volatile. He tried to reassure everyone to regain control, but it was like trying to patch a dam with paper. Each lie he told, each excuse he made only added weight to the collapse. The emotional beat for me was exquisite. I could feel the satisfaction coursing through me every time he faltered. But it wasn't pure glee, it was strategic. I was exhilarated, yes, but also focused. Each step had to be precise, each action calculated. Too much too soon, and he might panic in a way that caused irreparable harm to what I intended to preserve for myself. His social humiliation and financial loss, not destruction beyond repair. By the end of the first week of exposure, the pattern was undeniable. He was jittery, anxious, and visibly shaken. Colleagues were hesitant to trust him. Friends were whispering. Even family members had that subtle, questioning glance he had never seen before. And yet, he still had no idea that I was the architect behind it all. There was one night, after a particularly brutal day, when he came home, poured himself a drink, and muttered, "Something's wrong. I can feel it. But I don't know what." I smiled quietly from the other room, pretending to read a book. That was the moment I realized just how perfectly the plan was working. He was socially isolated, financially stressed, and emotionally desperate, all without realizing the source of the chaos. And that's when I knew I had reached a pivotal point. I wasn't just playing a game anymore. I was in full control. Every move, every whisper, every carefully timed reveal had placed him exactly where I wanted him. He thought he could manipulate the world and the people around him to suit his desires. But in reality, he was the puppet now, dancing to my tune without even knowing it. I didn't gloat, not aloud, not visibly. I stayed calm, composed, almost benign. That's the power of true control. Your prey never suspects your presence until it's too late. And he would find out, soon enough, that he was utterly alone in a world where he had counted on friends, family, and colleagues to prop him up. The best part, he was still scrambling, still trying to piece together what was happening, still clinging to his fragile ego. And I was already planning the next move, the one that would seal the deal, that would ensure he couldn't recover. By the time he realized what I had done, the damage would be complete, irreversible, and entirely his own fault for underestimating me. I wasn't cruel. I wasn't vindictive for the sake of malice. I was deliberate, calculated, and methodical. And for the first time in a long time, I felt powerful, not just in the sense of revenge, but in reclaiming myself, my life, and my dignity from someone who thought he could betray me and get away with it. By the time I went to bed that night, I wasn't just satisfied. I was exhilarated. I had broken the illusion, exposed the affair, and initiated the collapse of the man who thought he was untouchable. And the next phase would be even more devastating. He still had no idea that the woman he thought he could control had become the one orchestrating his downfall. And when he did realize it, the humiliation, the panic, and the desperation would be absolute. By the time it started in my mind, I realized something terrifyingly delicious. The man who once thought he was untouchable was now trembling in the shadow of a reality he couldn't control. And the best part, every step of his unraveling was happening exactly according to plan, because I had orchestrated it with surgical precision. It began with the legal front. He had always considered the law something he could charm or manipulate. I quietly consulted my own attorneys under the pretense of reviewing joint finances and estate matters, all while studying legal loopholes he had exposed in his arrogance. I discovered vulnerabilities in his contracts, minor irregularities in his investments, and gaps in his business agreements that could be exploited. Not a single illegal move on my part, but enough to set dominoes in motion. I initiated minor review requests on some of his deals, not calling attention to myself, but forcing him to scramble. Every email he wrote to explain discrepancies, every phone call he made to clarify misunderstandings, left a paper trail I could use later, and he didn't even know he was building the foundation for his own ruin. Watching him fumble through legal formalities, confused and anxious, gave me a calm, calculating satisfaction unlike anything I'd felt before. Financially, the plan progressed in parallel. Remember those subtle manipulations I set up weeks earlier? They started to compound beautifully. A few small misallocations here, a delayed payment there, minor errors that only seemed coincidental, but when they collided with his overconfidence, the fallout was catastrophic. Partners questioned his reliability. Clients hesitated. Investments that he bragged about over dinner suddenly seemed riskier in the eyes of outsiders. And all of it came together like a storm he could neither see nor predict. Meanwhile, his social network crumbled further. By now, friends who had previously hesitated to question him were actively distancing themselves. Casual inquiries from colleagues were met with skeptical glances. Family members were suddenly busy when he called. He tried desperately to explain, charm, and smooth over relationships, but the trust he had once taken for granted was evaporating before his eyes. I'll admit, I had moments of enjoyment, small, quiet moments where his growing desperation was almost comical, like the time he tried to host a casual dinner for friends to prove everything was fine, only to have one of his colleagues subtly drop a reference to something I'd leaked weeks before. He froze mid-sentence, then laughed nervously, trying to regain control. It was beautiful, utterly beautiful. As his confidence eroded, I began to layer the next phase, the psychological. Every interaction I had with him was calm, composed, almost benign. But behind that veneer, I was a storm. I let him speak, beg, make excuses, and stumble over his own words. I occasionally dropped subtle comments, careful, small, almost accidental, that reminded him of how powerless he had become. Every glance I gave, every tone of voice I used, reinforced the narrative I wanted him to internalize. He was losing everything, and there was no one to blame but himself. The escalation was methodical. A missed investment deadline, a small rumor spread among his peers, a subtle mention of the affair to someone he respected, all combined to dismantle his credibility. He was losing influence, friends, and even the financial stability he had relied on to assert power. And the more he panicked, the more he misstepped, accelerating his own downfall. One of the most satisfying parts was watching him beg without even realizing he was doing it. He started making awkward attempts to appease me, offering reassurances, gifts, apologies, anything to regain some semblance of control. I listened calmly, occasionally allowing a sly smile or a quiet, almost imperceptible laugh, letting him stew in his desperation. At this stage, the man who once believed he could charm and manipulate everyone around him had become a hollow version of himself. Friends refused to return calls. Colleagues avoided his office. Financially, he was bleeding small amounts he didn't understand, and investments he thought were secure were now teetering on the edge. Emotionally, he was fractured. And all of this, beautifully, was a product of his own arrogance, compounded by my meticulous strategy. There was a particular evening I remember vividly. He came home, disheveled and frantic, and tried to appeal to me in a way that he never had before. "Please," he said, voice cracking. I made mistakes. I can fix this. I'll do anything. Just please don't do this to me. I need you." I sipped my wine, leaning back in my chair, and gave him the calmest, most controlled look I could muster. "I'm listening," I said softly, though every fiber of my being was dancing with quiet triumph. He didn't realize that I had already anticipated this moment, that every apology, every plea, every desperate act of contrition was exactly what I wanted him to do. It was like watching a puppet dance on strings he couldn't see. "Anything," he repeated, desperation clear in every word. "I'll make it right. I'll give you whatever you want. Just please come back. And that's when I said it. Calmly, deliberately. No, the shock on his face was priceless. He blinked, trying to process the word. He stumbled, tried to speak, but nothing came out. I could see the panic settle in, thick and suffocating. This wasn't just rejection. This wasn't just revenge. This was the realization that he had lost everything. And it wasn't even because of me, it was because of himself. I stayed composed, letting the silence stretch. It was one of the most satisfying moments of my life. He was finally forced to confront the consequences of his choices, his arrogance, and his betrayal. And I remained calm, calculating, utterly in control. By the end of that evening, his world was unrecognizable. Socially, he was isolated. Professionally, his credibility was in tatters. Financially, cracks were forming that he couldn't patch. Emotionally, he was desperate, broken, and pleading. And I was alive, empowered, unstoppable. It wasn't cruelty for the sake of cruelty. It wasn't vindictiveness for the sake of anger. It was justice, perfectly executed. Every step of the plan had been calculated. Every move had been anticipated. And in that moment, as he sat there, finally acknowledging the weight of his mistakes, I realized that control, the kind I now possessed, was intoxicating. He would never betray me again. He would never underestimate me again. And even if he begged, groveled, or promised the world, he knew deep down that the power he once had was gone. Completely, irrevocably gone. And I had emerged from the shadows of betrayal stronger, smarter, and in complete command of my own life. It's funny how life has this way of turning betrayal into clarity. I spent weeks, months really, plotting every step of his downfall, and the satisfaction of watching him crumble was almost intoxicating. But the real victory came afterwards, in the quiet moments when I realized I wasn't just winning a revenge story, I was reclaiming myself. After the final confrontation, when he begged, groveled, and ultimately realized he had lost everything, I felt a weight lift off my shoulders. For years, I had been living in the shadow of his deceit, trying to convince myself that his charm, his manipulations, and his lies didn't hurt me. But they did, and they had for far too long. The satisfaction of seeing him humbled was tremendous, yes, but the real reward was the freedom it brought me. The first thing I did was take a deep, deliberate breath. I didn't run out screaming, didn't throw things in a rage, didn't plaster his betrayal all over social media like a cautionary tale. I didn't need to. Revenge had been served perfectly, like a chess game, executed over months with precision. And now, with the dust settled, I could focus on the life I wanted, not the life he had tried to control. Financial independence was the first priority. I had secretly maintained control of my own assets throughout the process, quietly moving funds, managing investments, and building a foundation that he had thought was under his influence. With his empire now crumbling, I finally formalized my position. I had enough resources to not just survive, but thrive. I invested wisely, diversified, and watched my net worth grow steadily while he scrambled to patch losses he had caused through his arrogance. There was a beautiful irony in that. The man who once thought money was power, who believed he could manipulate everyone around him, was now powerless. And I was financially secure, independent, and finally free from the fear of his whims or betrayals. Every statement I reviewed, every transaction I made, was a small, delicious reminder that I was untouchable, not because of wealth alone, but because I had mastered the strategy, patience, and foresight that he had utterly underestimated. Socially, I rebuilt my world on my own terms. Friends who had been loyal to me, despite everything, became my allies in a more meaningful way. Relationships that were previously superficial deepened. I no longer had to hide conversations, avoid topics, or navigate his ego-driven whims. I hosted dinners, gatherings, and casual coffee meetups where I was respected and admired, not for appearances, but for my wit, intelligence, and composure. People noticed the difference too. There was a quiet confidence that radiated from me, subtle but undeniable, and it was intoxicating to see those who had doubted me or underestimated me now respecting me without question. Rebuilding emotionally was the hardest part. It wasn't easy to undo the years of manipulation and betrayal, to stop doubting my own instincts and begin trusting myself fully again. But as I reflected on the journey, I realized something profound. Every tear, every sleepless night, every surge of anger had honed me. I was stronger, sharper, and more self-assured than I had ever been. And that was something no one, not him, not his friends, not even his carefully curated social circle, could ever take from me. There were moments of humor in this new life, subtle, wry, the kind you savor quietly. Like the time he called me months later, voice shaky, trying to explain how he had been recovering and hinting at wanting to reconcile. I listened patiently, the corner of my mouth twitching into a subtle smile, and replied, "I'm glad you're reflecting. I hope you're learning." The silence that followed was exquisite. He realized too late that reconciliation was never an option. Not because I was cruel, but because I had finally learned the value of my own peace, and it was non-negotiable. Even everyday interactions were subtly liberating. Grocery stores, work meetings, casual neighborhood encounters. I no longer had to navigate his shadows. I could assert myself confidently, with humor and grace, in ways I had been too cautious to do before. And every time I caught a fleeting glimpse of him, whether in social media, mutual acquaintances, or rare encounters, the memory of his downfall was a quiet, satisfying affirmation that I had done what was necessary and done it impeccably. Financially, socially, and emotionally, I had risen from the ashes of betrayal. I had reclaimed not just control over my life, but a sense of dignity and empowerment that no one could diminish. Revenge, yes, had been sweet, but it was the reclamation of self that mattered most. I realized, with a surprising sense of calm and subtle amusement, that the journey wasn't just about teaching him a lesson. It was about teaching myself that I deserved respect, integrity, and happiness, and that I was capable of creating it even in the aftermath of deception. I won't lie, part of me still felt that thrill of control when thinking about his final despair, the collapse of his social and professional standing, and his desperate pleas. But that thrill was tempered now by peace. I didn't need to gloat. I didn't need to manipulate anyone else to see his ruin. The work was done, and it had been done in a way that left me stronger, wiser, and free. I started setting new goals for myself, projects I had postponed, passions I had shelved, and adventures I had dreamed of. Travel, education, career moves, new friendships. I embraced each opportunity with a vigor that surprised even me. And the best part? I didn't need anyone to validate it. My life was mine. I was finally untethered, unshackled from the past, and completely, unequivocally free. There were small victories too, the kind that make life feel rich and complete. A quiet lunch with a friend who had once doubted me. A new project at work where my decisions were valued without question. Even the simple act of walking through a park, noticing details without the constant shadow of betrayal in my mind, it was bliss. I had rebuilt everything from scratch, stronger, smarter, and better equipped to navigate the world. And as I sit here now, reflecting on it all, I can say with confidence that he is a man humbled, broken, frustrated, and aware of his own mistakes. He is left to pick up the pieces of a life he had thought he controlled. And I am triumphant, free, empowered, and perhaps, most importantly, at peace with myself. There's a subtle humor in it too. The irony of the situation isn't lost on me. The man who believed he could manipulate everyone around him, who thought he could betray with impunity, now serves as a reminder that arrogance and deceit carry consequences, and that sometimes the person you underestimate most is the one who will rise above it all. I smiled quietly to myself, not out of malice, but out of satisfaction, understanding, and calm amusement. I have risen from the ashes, rebuilt my life, and reclaimed my dignity. He has learned his lesson, and I have learned something even more important. My power, my worth, and my peace cannot be stolen. They can only be claimed, and I have claimed them completely.